morning, Silas. How are
Good
you
morning.
doing?
Good.
I'm glad you came back to see us. So, let's just go ahead and get started. This week is going to be a little bit longer than last week. We going to go ahead and get into the problem itself of anxiety. We're also going to, we don't have to talk about confidentiality or anything like that. We don't have to explain the therapy session this time around because you know what that. Okay. So, last week we did talk a lot about anxiety. Do you remember that? Okay. You okay? So, last week, between our last session and now, on a scale of 0 to 10, how was your anxiety level? 0 being the best, 10 being the worst anxiety you've felt. About a 9? Wow, that's pretty high. So right now, what would you say your anxiety level is?
About a 7.
So it's a little lower than last week. Okay. So can you give me an update on last week? What had you feeling so anxious, maybe?
So there's a couple of different things. One was that earlier in the week I had a paper that I didn't do too well on, and then later that day I had an argument with my dad that didn't go too well, and then later in the week, towards the end of it, I had an argument with my sister.
Oh goodness. So you said you had a paper that you didn't feel like you did very well on. You had an argument with your dad that same day, and then later in the week you had an argument with your older sister. Is that correct? Wow, I could really see why you would be having a lot of anxiety. That's a lot to happen in your week. So I think what we need to do first is set the agenda for the day. We've already talked about a mood check, and we've already talked about why you were feeling anxious. So we kind of already did an update. But for the rest of the session, I want to go ahead and I want to prioritize the agenda and see which one of those 3 things that happened last week that you would prefer to talk about. And then we'll go over the homework, and we'll talk a little bit about coping skills that we can offer you through CBT to help with some of those anxiety issues and the moments when you're feeling anxious. Does that make sense?
Yes, ma'am.
And then we're probably going to assign new homework, and we're going to do a summary of the session like we did last week. And then we're going to give you time for feedback. That makes sense?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So let's go ahead and prioritize which problem you want to talk about. Which one do you think was the one you need to talk about most?
Probably the paper.
The paper. Tell me about the paper.
It was just going really bad for me.
So what kind of paper was it?
It was information.
So what did you feel like was going wrong with it?
I didn't think I was using grammar right, and then I didn't think I was using the information properly, and I didn't think I had the right information.
Okay, so you felt like your grammar was wrong and that you weren't using the correct information?
Yes.
Okay. Remember last week when we did the homework and we were going to talk about when you were feeling anxious, you were going to write your thoughts down and the situation down. Were you able to write some of those thoughts that you were feeling down later on about that paper? What were some of those thoughts?
Like with the paper, I was thinking like if I don't do too well, I'll fail the paper. I might fail the class. If I keep doing on this track, it just won't work well for me.
So you thought I'm doing bad on the test or on the paper, so I'm going to do bad in the class. Did you have any other thoughts after that?
That it might roll over to more personal life. Like I didn't think maybe like since I couldn't use grammar right, maybe it was appalling people that were near me.
So you felt like your conversation with people might be affected because of you not being able to do well with the grammar.
Yes.
Okay. Well, in CBT we call that a cognitive distortion. Have you ever heard of that?
No.
What a cognitive distortion is when you start out with a thought and it leads to another thought that's totally distorted from the first thought. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And what you did is actually something called catastrophizing. And what that is when you take a simple thought like I'm not doing well on this paper and you make it go all the way from not doing well on the paper to I'm going to fail the class to I'm not going to be able to talk to my friends or family or other people in conversation. Does that make sense? Did you see how you did that?
Yes.
Okay. Well, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about how maybe we can help you with that. Okay. One of the techniques that we like to use is called we get you to list the evidence that confirms your thought, and then we get you to list the evidence that don't confirm that thought. Does that make sense? So, what is some evidence of you're not going to have good conversation with friends? What evidence would you have to back up that catastrophizing thought?
I don't know. I feel like people are just kind of shortening our conversations. They're trying to get out of them. We're trying to dodge them.
So you thought that?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So you thought that people were dodging you. So, okay, so we're still thinking about what you're thinking. Give me something solid, evidence that shows somebody doesn't want to talk to you.
I don't know. A couple of my friends just kind of give me these glares whenever we try to talk.
Mm-hmm.
And then whenever I'd ask them something, they really would just kind of dodge it and walk away.
Okay.
And they just didn't see it.
Okay. So your evidence is the people just walked away.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's try and think of some evidence that you are a good person to talk to. Is there any evidence for that?
I don't know. There are a couple of other people that might want to stay and talk to me a little bit more.
So you have evidence of some of your friends walking away, but you also have evidence of some of your friends staying. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So when you were thinking about, you were doing poorly on the writing assignment, you failed the class, and now nobody wanted to talk to you, how much did you really believe that when you were thinking of it?
Probably 50, 60.
About 50 or 60%. Okay. Now that you see there's actually some evidence that goes against that, how much would you say you believe that now?
I don't know, maybe 40.
40, so it's a little less. So do you see how that technique might be able to get your thought process a little bit closer to the actual thought instead of the distortion that you were thinking?
Yes, ma'am.
So do you think that maybe you could do that some on your own?
Maybe.
Okay. Well, we have another one that we do. It's actually what you do is best case scenario, worst case scenario. So what would the best case scenario be if you did well on the test?
That I passed the test.
Okay. What would the worst case scenario be?
That I failed the test.
Okay, so you've got two polar opposites. One is you would pass the test, one is you would fail the test, right?
Yes, ma'am.
So where do you fall in that?
I think I fall near the fail.
Near the fail? So do you feel like you fall near the fail more now than you did back then, or do you feel a little better about it now?
Maybe
A little bit better. So do you think this technique, you said before, if you maybe practice it, it might help a little bit more?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So I think with this one, we could practice it a little bit more. I think what I want to do is to assign you some more homework. I want you to go ahead and keep writing your thought records down. I really think that you were able to do that and pull those thoughts out. I think that was really important. But with the thoughts, I want you to do some of this therapy. I want you to, when you have a thought like that, I want you to write down the evidence that supports the thought and the evidence that does not support the thought. Does that make sense?
Yes, ma'am.
And then I also, maybe you could do best or worst case scenario if you want to. That may be a little bit much. Well, what we did a while ago, best case scenario was you would pass the class. The worst was you wouldn't pass the class. So, but if you feel like that's a little bit too overwhelming to do, let's just stick with the evidence, okay? Because that seemed to really help you. So right now, if we did another scale of anxiety, and it was from 0 to 10 about the paper, where would you say you felt right now after doing some of this?
Paper,
not necessarily the paper. How do you feel like your conversations with friends? Remember that distorted thought that you had? Now that we did some of the therapy, how do you feel like how would the thought of I can't talk to my friends because I failed this paper. Where would you say you're at on the scale right now for that? Where before you was way high about being anxious about it. Where would you say you are now after doing some of these?
Towards 5 or 6.
5 or 6. So it seems to.
Mid-range.
Oh, well, that's a lot better than being up high to 9. So maybe these techniques not work for you. It sounds like. Okay. Well, we did. So you understand the homework, correct?
Yes,
Okay. Explain that homework to me so we'll make sure we got it.
I'll try to write down, try to continue what I did last week, first of all, with my thoughts, and then continuing on that path, I have to think about, like, what are the outcomes that could happen, or if I feel like that's too overwhelming, I could just do positive to negative.
Right. Okay. That sounds good. Sounds like you've got that understanding down pat with the homework. So I think we're going to wrap it up today. But we talked a whole lot about stuff. We did a mood check. Last week it sounded like you had a really rough week and your mood was pretty anxious. When you got here, it was still kind of high, not quite as high as last week. We talked about that. We talked about which one of those situations you wanted to talk about more. And then we kind of went over some of the CBT therapy and showed you some tools that you could use. And then we also discussed the homework from last week, and we discussed the new homework. Does that sound about right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So, how do you feel about the session today?
I feel like it went pretty well, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
It helps a little bit.
So you feel like it helped?
Yeah, I just don't know how it's going to affect when myself.
By yourself.
Because when I'm here with you, I kind of have this you
Mm-hmm.
pull it out a little bit more.
Mm-hmm.
I have another mind there to help me get what's good out.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if I'm doing it by myself, I still kind of am in the mind frame of negativity.
Mm-hmm.
So it could distort what I think is good.
Okay. Well, that makes sense. So, we had discussed my role before was to guide you through some of these things. So you kind of feel like that's what we did today. And you're kind of concerned about being able to do it on your own, correct? Okay. Well, every week we'll go over it, and I will continue to help guide you to where you can do that by yourself. So I don't expect you to do it perfect first week. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I will see you next week. I'm so glad you came back in, and I think we made a lot of progress this week. Have a good day.
All right.